Africa holds 65% of the world's uncultivated arable land, and quietly, systematically over the past 2 decades, foreign governments and their state-backed companies have been acquiring it, not to feed Africans, but to feed their own populations back home. You've seen the headlines about food insecurity on the continent. What you haven't been told is that the food insecurity and the land acquisition are part of the same story. The real axis of what is happening in sub-Saharan Africa is not a development narrative. It is a food sovereignty transfer. The systematic conversion of land that could feed African populations into offshore agricultural supply chains for the Gulf states, East Asia, and Western investment funds. Beneath the language of investment and modernization, a different logic is operating: the externalization of food production risk onto wealthy, land-scarce nations, onto a continent that cannot yet politically resist it. The trigger: 2008 and the logic of food panic. The starting point is 2008, not the financial crisis, or rather, not only the financial crisis. Between 2007 and 2008, global wheat and corn prices more than tripled. Rice prices climbed 5-fold. The surge triggered riots in nearly 24 countries and pushed 75 million more people into poverty. For the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, the shock was existential. These nations import approximately 85 to 90% of their basic food requirements. When global grain markets seized up, their entire food supply was suddenly dependent on the decisions of exporting governments who were themselves under domestic political pressure to restrict exports. Saudi Arabia had already been running an experiment in domestic wheat production since the 1970s, pumping non-renewable fossil aquifer water to grow grain in the desert. By 2008, the water was nearly gone. The Saudi government announced it would phase out domestic wheat production entirely by 2016. That decision, to stop trying to grow food at home, was made before a single new African lease was signed. The land acquisitions that followed were the strategic answer to the domestic failure. This is what Lorenzo Catula in The Great African Land Grab 2013 identified as the structural turn, from market sourcing of food to direct control of offshore production. The distinction matters. Previous foreign agricultural investment was market-seeking. Investors went abroad to sell food to local populations. This new wave was resource-seeking. The food grown on African soil would not enter African markets. It would be repatriated. Who is buying, and the numbers they don't advertise? Since 2000, foreign investors, Chinese, Emirati, Lebanese, American, European, South Korean, and Indian, have acquired several tens of millions of hectares of arable land in Africa through concession agreements. The Land Matrix Initiative, the most comprehensive independent database of large-scale land acquisitions, records Africa as the single most targeted region on Earth, accounting for roughly 37% of all documented global transactions. The Gulf states are among the largest actors by strategic intent, even if not always by largest by raw hectare count. Saudi investors have leased a combined 1 million hectares across Morocco, Ethiopia, Mali, Mauritania, Sudan, South Sudan, and Senegal, under the King Abdullah Initiative for Saudi Investment Abroad. The UAE has 56 documented projects spanning millions of acres from Sudan to Mauritania to Uganda. And the Africa Center for Strategic Studies estimates that Emirati Agribusiness has invested $11.9 billion in East African agriculture alone since 2009. Sudan is the most targeted single country, and the numbers from Sudan tell the full story. The Land Matrix database has tracked 762,208 documented large-scale acquisitions in Sudan, the majority concluded after 2000. In 2012 alone, the Sudanese government granted 116,000 hectares to a Qatari company, 100,000 hectares to the UAE, and 840,000 hectares each to Egypt and Saudi Arabia under 50-year leases. A Lebanese company, GLB Invest, holds a 99-year renewable lease on 87,200 hectares. Saudi Arabia's grant was described in legal terms not as a lease, but as a freehold, a land enclave within Sudan, effectively belonging to a foreign sovereign. Investors from Jordan, Turkey, Egypt, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia were simultaneously negotiating a further 3.4 million hectares, still under active discussion at that time. This is not investment in African agriculture. This is the physical relocation of agricultural production capacity to a jurisdiction with cheap land, cheap water, minimal environmental regulations, and limited ability to enforce domestic food security requirements. What is actually being grown and where it goes? Here is the detail almost no coverage reaches. In Sudan, the dominant crop being cultivated on foreign-acquired land is not rice, not wheat for local consumption, not cassava. It is alfalfa, Medicago sativa, a high-protein fodder crop with no nutritional role for African populations. Alfalfa grown on Sudanese soil, irrigated by Nile water, harvested up to 10 times per year, is exported directly to industrial livestock farms in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. The Gulf states are now among the world's largest alfalfa importers. The Arab market requires approximately 20 million tons of alfalfa annually. Sudan currently produces around 5 million tons. The gap is being closed through further acquisition. The pattern in Senegal follows the same logic. A U.S.-listed company, African Agriculture, acquired 25,000 hectares of land on the NDL Nature Reserve, partially declassified by presidential decree in 2012 to accommodate an earlier Italian venture, and in January 2024 announced a supply agreement to export alfalfa to South Korea. The company simultaneously detailed plans to capture a share of the Saudi and UAE feed markets. The water it used came from the Lac de Guiers, the only freshwater reservoir in the lower Senegal River basin, also supplying drinking water to Dakar. The company described that water access as costing 1/100th of what comparable water costs foreign competitors. In Mozambique, where approximately 35% of households are chronically food insecure, only 32,000 hectares out of 433,000 approved for land deals between 2007 and 2009 were allocated for food crops. The rest was designated for export commodities, biofuels, cut flowers, cash crops destined for European markets. In Ethiopia's Gambela region, the Saudi-Ethiopian Billionaires company, Saudi Star Agricultural Development, operates on 10,000 hectares under a 50-year lease. The displacement of local populations from western Ethiopia to make way for the operation is documented. The promised 4,000 to 5,000 farm jobs did not materialize as permanent positions. They were converted into seasonal and short-term labor. Gambella has ceded nearly a quarter of its best farmland across numerous investor deals. The region remains one of the most food-insecure zones in Ethiopia. The structural parallel, the second scramble. You recognize this pattern because it has happened before. The structure is not new. What is new is the legal architecture used to execute it. The Berlin Conference of 1884 established the formal legal framework for the partition of Africa among European powers. What followed was not simply territorial acquisition, it was the systematic reorientation of African agricultural production toward the needs of European industrial economies. Cotton from Sudan fed British textile mills in Manchester. Palm oil from West Africa became the feedstock for European soap and margarine industries. Ground nuts from Senegal supplied French cooking oil. In every case, the colonial relationship was defined by a structural asymmetry. African land and labor produced food and raw materials for populations elsewhere, while African populations remained dependent on what could be grown on whatever land was left. Walter Rodney documented this mechanism in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, 1972, with specific attention to how colonial agricultural policy actively suppressed African food crop production in favor of export crops. The diversion was not incidental, it was the point. Export crop production generated foreign exchange revenue that colonial administrations could tax and remit to metropolitan capitals. Food insecurity in the colony was, in Rodney's framing, an acceptable externality of the export model. What you are watching now is structurally analogous. The actors are different. Gulf sovereigns and East Asian state-backed firms, rather than European crown administrations. The legal vehicle is different, long-term lease rather than imperial decree. But the relationship between the land, the production system, and the destination of the harvest is identical. African soil, African water, African labor producing crops that leave the continent to feed populations somewhere else. Jacques Diouf, when he was Director General of the UN Food and Agricultural Organization, named this directly. Competition by foreign importing countries to secure foreign farmland to enhance their own food security is, in his words, likely to create a neo-colonial system. The water dimension, the grab beneath the grab. But the more consequential piece is this: the land is not the primary asset, the water is. African land without irrigation infrastructure is marginal agricultural land. The deals being struck are not simply for territory, they are for access to river systems, aquifer access, and irrigation rights in some of the most water-rich zones on the continent. In Sudan, the foreign land acquisitions are concentrated in the Nile Corridor, the agricultural belt irrigated by the world's longest river system. When a foreign company acquires a 50-year lease on 840,000 hectares of Sudanese Nile-adjacent land, it is not primarily acquiring soil, it is acquiring a claim on Nile water that Sudan will be legally obligated to deliver for the duration of that lease. This matters at a scale that transcends bilateral trade relations. Egypt's entire agricultural economy is built on Nile water. Ethiopia's Grand Renaissance Dam project already strains the downstream allocation. Foreign land acquisition in the Nile Basin that requires irrigation draws on the same finite water column that Egypt depends on for food production for its 105 million people. There is no framework, no multilateral agreement, no UN mechanism that governs what happens when foreign land leases generate water demand that conflicts with downstream human food security requirements. The Georgetown Security Studies Review identified this dynamic in 2019. The Gulf states are not only buying land in the Horn of Africa, they are buying water resources in Ethiopia, Sudan, and Somalia simultaneously.
Saudi Arabia and the UAE, through their agricultural concessions, have effectively inserted themselves as water claimants in one of the most geopolitically contested river systems on Earth. What the land actually produces and the fiction of utilization. Here is the data about what actually happens after the contracts are signed. According to GIS reports of land matrix data, only slightly more than 50% of finalized deals result in land that is operational for any purpose at all. Actual farming is taking place on only 11% of the contracted land. A satellite review of large-scale land acquisitions in Sudan found that only 4.2% of acquired land is actually producing food. A separate study found that 24% of deals fail outright. These are sometimes called zombie deals, land acquired, held, not farmed, while blocking local communities from using it. The lease is honored by the host government, local farmers are displaced, foreign engineers arrive, survey the land, build some initial infrastructure, then the project stalls, financing dries up, commodity prices shift, the investor loses interest, and the land sits idle. No food for the Gulf, no food or employment for local communities. Communities lose access to land they have worked for generations. This is the worst possible outcome of the model, and it is, by the data, the most common one. What the model actually delivers in the majority of documented cases is displacement without development.
The promise made by foreign investors in nearly every documented deal is jobs. Employment creation is mentioned in only 15% of African land acquisition contracts, according to Land Matrix data. In the cases where it is promised, the delivery record is consistent. The Gambella operations promised thousands of permanent jobs and delivered seasonal labor. The Senegalese operation under African agriculture had workers who reported going 3 months without pay by late 2024, while management departed and the company teetered toward delisting from NASDAQ. The Mozambican Mvest operation promised significant job creation to justify villager displacement and delivered very little. The role of Western financial institutions, the player most coverage misses. Following the 2007 to 2008 financial crisis and the collapse of housing markets in the United States and Europe, private equity funds and institutional investors began treating African farmland as an asset class. Farmland offered what collapsed financial instruments no longer could: a tangible, appreciating asset with long-term yield potential. The Oakland Institute, in its 2011 series on land investment deals in Africa, documented how the same financial firms whose instruments had contributed to the 2008 crash were now directing capital toward African farmland acquisition. The United Kingdom is listed by the Land Portal as the single largest country of origin for large-scale land acquisitions globally. The U.S. follows. The UAE, South Africa, Canada, and Malaysia come next. China, despite receiving the majority of media attention in coverage of African land deals, ranks considerably lower in the documented transaction data than the framing of most coverage implies. The dominant actors in African land acquisition, by number of documented transactions, are Western private equity and institutional investment vehicles, not Chinese state entities. This reframes what you've been told. The dominant frame in coverage of Chinese engagement in Africa is extractive and strategic. That is accurate in some domains: infrastructure lending, mineral extraction, port access. But in agricultural land acquisition specifically, the more consequential actors by transaction volume are British and American investment funds, not Chinese state entities. The governance gap. Why African governments continue to sign these agreements. When the evidence of their limited benefit is now extensive, the structural answer is not corruption alone, though corruption exists. The structural answer is the governance architecture that makes these deals possible.
In most African countries, land tenure law is organized around a system in which the state owns all land and individuals hold customary use rights. This structure, inherited from colonial land tenure legislation, means that a national government can legally lease land that customary users have farmed for generations, without those users being the legal owners, and therefore without requiring their consent or compensation. The land is not stolen from the legal owner because in many African legal systems, the farmer is not the legal owner, the state is. Lorenzo Catula's research in Ghana, Mali, Tanzania, and Mozambique documented this mechanism in detail. The concession agreements are not violations of African law, they are expressions of African law as written. Law that was originally designed by colonial administrations precisely to enable the extraction of land value from populations who would never see the revenue. This is not a coincidence of legacy. It is the continued operational utility of a colonial legal architecture for a post-colonial extractive purpose. The reframe: food sovereignty as the structural concept. Beneath the debate about whether these land deals represent investment or extraction, a more precise conceptual framework has been established in the agricultural policy literature: food sovereignty. The concept, developed by the international peasant movement La Via Campesina in 1996 and analyzed in detail by researchers including Raj Patel in Stuffed and Starved: The Hidden Battle for the World Food System, 2007, holds that food security and food sovereignty are distinct conditions. A population can be food secure, getting enough calories, while having no sovereignty over its food system. Food sovereignty is the right of peoples to define their own food and agriculture systems, to determine what is grown on their land, and to retain control over whether the output of their agricultural sector serves domestic food needs or external commercial demands. What the data from Sudan, Ethiopia, Mozambique, and Senegal shows is that the large-scale land acquisition model structurally transfers food sovereignty away from host country populations and towards the food security strategies of investing nations. This is not an incidental outcome, it is the stated design of the model. The UAE's National Food Strategy, announced in 2018, explicitly committed the country to becoming #1 in the Global Food Security Index by acquiring offshore production capacity. Saudi Arabia's King Abdullah Initiative for Saudi Investment Abroad was explicitly structured to externalize food production risk onto host country land and water systems. A Science Direct study published in 2021 evaluated 38 African countries against the food crops being grown on land acquired within their borders. The finding was precise. Large-scale land acquisitions are only likely to address the identified food security needs of 7 of those 38 countries. On 83% of the acquired area, there is high risk of land conflict or deforestation. The more productive lands are disproportionately allocated to export crops. Food crops are pushed to more marginal land. The historical precedent that ends the same way. In Madagascar in 2009, South Korea's Daewoo Corporation was negotiating a lease for 1.3 million hectares, half of the country's total agricultural land, to produce corn and palm oil for South Korean markets. The deal became public. The population's anger about the sale of their agricultural land to a foreign corporation contributed directly to the collapse of the government of President Marc Ravalomanana. He was ousted in March 2009. The Daewoo deal was canceled. In Sudan in 2016, after the government continued leasing land to Gulf state investors during a period when much of the country was entering a food crisis, there were massive popular protests. In Ethiopia that same year, Ethiopians burned investors' vehicles and buildings in response to land grabbing and human rights violations. The government's response resulted in the deaths of 55 protesters. No government reforms were initiated to protect local communities.
The pattern here is not unique to Africa. It is the pattern of imperial overstretch, the structural condition identified by Paul Kennedy in The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, 1987, applied to food system extraction rather than territorial empire. When the extraction becomes visible, when the dispossession becomes intolerable, political instability follows. The extraction model generates the very instability that makes foreign investment in the region appear riskier, which in turn reduces capital inflows, which reduces the development outcomes that were promised to justify the extraction in the first place. This is the internal contradiction of the model, and it is not theoretical. It has already played out in Madagascar, in Sudan, in Ethiopia. It is playing out now in Senegal. What the structural logic demands. What you are watching is not a series of bilateral agricultural investment deals. It is the formation of a new global food production geography in which land-scarce, capital-rich states externalize their food production onto land-abundant, capital-poor states, and in which the African populations whose soil and water make this possible are systematically excluded from the benefit. The structural forces driving this are not going to reverse under current conditions. Climate change is reducing domestic agricultural yields in the Gulf and East Asia, while simultaneously making African farmland more, not less, attractive to foreign acquisition. By 2050, global food demand will require approximately 70% more production than current levels. The countries that have already secured long-term lease positions on African agricultural land, 50-year, 99-year renewable leases signed at prices between $1.20 and $8 per hectare per year, have locked in those positions against that demographic reality. The land is leased, the water rights follow the land, the food leaves the continent, and the governance frameworks that would allow African populations to contest these arrangements, community consent requirements, transparent contract publication, domestic food security reservation clauses, are absent from nearly every documented deal. Every news cycle about African food insecurity, about aid dependency, about the continent's agricultural potential remaining unrealized should now read differently to you. The potential is not unrealized. It is being realized by someone else for someone else's food security on terms that were negotiated without the people who live on the land having any formal role in the process. That is the structural reality the headlines don't assemble. Now you have the full picture. If you want more videos like this, subscribe.